Welcome to a world with limitless possibilities. A world where pain and suffering are matched only by the sounds of those who endure it. Welcome to your nightmare.
Welcome to your nightmare.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Nightmare. For tonight's story, I'm going to be narrating a tale for you called Blackwood Manor. I do hope you all enjoy. The local real estate agent, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, called it a property with significant historical gravity. To Elias, a freelance archivist who specialized in cataloging the estates of the eccentric and the dead, it was just another 3-week paycheck. Blackwood Manor didn't sit on a hill. It seemed to crouch in a valley of gray mist, 3 stories of rotting cedar and Victorian ambition. The air around it felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something thicker, something that tasted of copper and wet wool. The front door didn't creak when Elias opened it. It sighed. He stepped into a foyer that smelled of lemon oil and ancient dust. His task was simple: inventory the library of the late Silas Blackwood, a man who had spent 40 years obsessed with the architecture of the transition. Elias set up his cot in the kitchen, the only room that felt remotely tethered to the modern world. He avoided the mirrors, not because he was superstitious, but because the glass in this house was old and wavy, distorting his face into a melting mask whenever he caught his reflection. It began at 3:14 a.m. A sound like a dry branch scraping against a window pane echoed through the house. But there were no trees near the master bedroom. Elias lay still, listening to the house settle. Houses always settle. Wood expands, stones shift, and pipes groan under the weight of P equals PGH, the pressure of the standing water and the lines. But this wasn't settling. This was rhythmic. It sounded like someone pulling a heavy sack of flour across the floorboards upstairs, followed by the sharp click of a cane. Elias pulled the quilt tighter. He told himself it was rats, large, rhythmic, cane-wielding rats. By day 3, the isolation began to grate. The library was a circular room with shelves that reached towards a domed ceiling. Silas Blackwood's collection was unsettling. There were no novels here, only blueprints of prisons, schematics for the spirit-catching labyrinths, and journals filled with frantic, cramped handwriting. Elias spent hours cataloging titles, like the geometry of grief and the vessels for the formless. He found a reoccurring equation, scrawled in the margins of almost every book. S equals the integral of dq lost over t void. It looked like a bastardization of the second law of thermodynamics, an entropy of the soul. Elias laughed it off, but his hand shook as he typed his entries into his laptop. He was reaching for a leather-bound folio on the top shelf when he felt it. A breath. A cold, damp puff of air against the back of his neck. He spun around. The library was empty, but the dust motes in the air were behaving strangely. Instead of drifting aimlessly, they were swirling in a tight vertical vortex in the center of the room. "Silas?" Elias whispered, feeling foolish. The vortex collapsed. On the floor, spelled out in the gray dust, was a single word: stay. By the second week, the house began to change. Elias would walk down a hallway to the kitchen, only to find himself standing in front of the basement door. He'd turn back, and the hallway would be longer, unreasonably so. He measured it once. The hallway was 33 feet long, but it took him 45 paces to reach the end. The physics of the manor were warping. He felt a constant sense of vertigo, as if the house were tilting at an angle that his inner ear couldn't quite calculate. The storm hit on Tuesday. Rain lashed the house, but it didn't sound like water. It sounded like gravel hitting the roof. Elias went to the kitchen to boil tea, his only comfort. As he began to whistle, he noticed a leak in the ceiling. A dark, viscous drop fell into his mug. It wasn't water. It was thick, dark, and smelled of iron. He looked up. The ceiling wasn't leaking. It was sweating. Crimson beads were forming on the plaster, swelling until they fell like heavy tears. He grabbed his car keys. It was time to leave. Professionalism be damned. He ran to the front door and threw his weight against it. It wouldn't budge. He tried the windows, but the glass was no longer wavy. It was solid steel, disguised as wood and pain. He ran back into the kitchen to grab his phone, but the kitchen was gone. In its place was a room he hadn't seen before. A nursery. It was filled with rotted wood toys and a single rocking chair. The chair was moving. "You're not real," Elias whispered, his heart hammering at 140 beats per minute. "This is a psychological response to isolation and mold spores. Spores can cause hallucinations." The rocking chair stopped. "Is that what you need to believe, Elias?" The voice didn't come from the chair. It came from the walls. It sounded like the grinding of stones. "Silas wanted to build a bridge," the walls whispered. "A house that wasn't a home, but a throat. He realized that to keep a soul from drifting into the void, you must give it a cage of perfect angles." Elias backed away, but the door behind him had vanished. He was trapped in the nursery. The walls began to pulse, rhythmic and wet, like a giant heart. He realized then what Silas Blackwood had discovered. The house wasn't haunted by spirits. The house was the spirit. Silas hadn't died in his bed. He had folded himself into the architecture. The wood was his bone. The insulation was his nerves, the plumbing his vines. The floorboards beneath Elias's feet were softened. They felt like flesh. He looked down and saw his own sneakers sinking into the wood. The floor was swallowing him, slowly, like quicksand made of mahogany. "You're the new marrow," the house groaned. "The library needs a librarian. The halls need a heartbeat." Elias scrambled for his utility knife, slashing at the floor. Instead of wood splinters, the floor bled. A deep, guttural howl shook the manor, a sound of immense pain and hunger. He managed to pull 1 foot free, losing a shoe in the process. He ran toward the only opening left, a small crawl space near the baseboards. He squeezed through, skinning his shoulders, falling into a darkness that smelled of earth and old copper. He crawled for what felt like miles through the veins of the house. He saw things behind the walls, piles of old watches, locks of hair tied with ribbon, and the remains of those who had come before him. Eventually, he saw a light, a crack in the exterior foundation. With a scream of pure, primal effort, Elias threw himself at the gap. The house tightened around him, the joists acting like ribs trying to crush the breath from his lungs. He felt a hand, a cold, wooden hand, grasp at his ankle. "Stay," the house roared. Elias kicked with his remaining shoe, feeling something crack. He lunged forward, bursting through the rotted stone of the foundation and tumbling onto the wet, muddy grass of the yard. Elias didn't stop running until he reached the main road. He never went back for his car. He never went back for his laptop. Months later, he sat in a brightly lit coffee shop in the city, the hum of the espresso machine acting as a shield against the silence. He opened a newspaper and saw a small real estate listing in the back. For sale, Blackwood Manor, historical charm, requires the right occupant, a place where you can truly lose yourself. Elias looked at his hands. They were still stained with a faint reddish-brown tint that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He reached for his coffee, but his hand stopped an inch from the mug. On the surface of the latte, the foam had shifted. It hadn't been stirred, but the bubbles had formed a perfect tiny equation. S equals the integral of dq lost over t void. Elias looked into the window reflection. Behind him, in the crowded shop, he saw a door of rotting cedar that shouldn't be there. The house didn't need him to be inside, it to own him. He was already part of the inventory. That is all for this episode of Nightmare. I would like to thank everyone for listening in on this episode, and as always, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And until next time, sleep well.